The rain fell in slow, heavy drops, soaking into the freshly dug earth. The sky was a dull shade of grey, as if mourning along with the hundreds of people gathered around the polished mahogany coffin. The weight of grief hung thick in the air, silent sobs breaking the hush as the priest's voice carried over the rows of mourners. It was the funeral of Robert Langford, a millionaire businessman whose influence stretched far beyond the towering buildings he owned. His empire was vast, his power undeniable. But today, none of that mattered. Today, he was just a man being lowered into the ground, leaving behind a legacy and a mystery. Among the sea of black-clad figures stood a young woman, her face pale against the veil that covered her sorrowful eyes. Evelyn Langford, the only daughter of the late tycoon, had barely moved since the ceremony began. She stood rigid, hands clasped together, staring at the casket as though willing it to open. As though this were all some elaborate mistake. She had not cried, had not spoken, only silence surrounded her. But then, something happened. Just as the priest uttered the final prayer, a sudden gasp rippled through the crowd. Evelyn moved. No, she didn't just move, she collapsed. Her body jerked forward as if some invisible force had pulled her down. Murmurs rose as people rushed toward her, but before anyone could reach her, she let out a strangled sound, a sound that sent chills down the spines of those who heard it, a cry mixed with disbelief and terror. Her lips parted, her breathing uneven. She tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Her fingers clawed weakly at the damp grass beneath her as she struggled to push herself up. Then, with wide, unblinking eyes, she turned toward the casket and screamed, a shrill, heart-wrenching scream that silenced the entire gathering. People froze. Some looked at each other in confusion, others in growing fear. The priest clutched his Bible tighter, his face pale. Evelyn's mother, Charlotte Langford, let out a panicked cry, rushing to her daughter's side. But Evelyn wouldn't stop, shaking. Her hands trembled as she pointed a shaking finger at the coffin. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said something that sent a shudder through everyone present. He's not dead. Gasps erupted around her. The words hung in the air. Impossible. Absurd. But the conviction in Evelyn's voice made them impossible to ignore. People began to whisper. Was she hallucinating? Was this the shock of grief playing tricks on her mind? Charlotte clutched Evelyn's arm, trying to steady her, but the young woman's body remained tense, frozen in terror. One of the funeral attendants, a tall man in a black suit, stepped forward hesitantly. Miss Langford, I understand this is a difficult time, but… No! Evelyn's voice cracked as she pushed herself up. Her breath came in short, uneven gasps. I saw it. I saw him move. He's alive. The silence that followed was suffocating. The wind howled through the cemetery, rustling the leaves of the old oak trees, as if nature itself had heard her chilling words. The murmurs turned into uneasy shuffling. Some people looked at the casket, others at Evelyn, unsure whether to believe her or dismiss this as the delusions of a grieving daughter. Charlotte Langford swallowed hard, her face stricken with both fear and confusion. Sweetheart, you're in shock, she whispered, her grip tightening around Evelyn's arm. Your father is gone. Evelyn shook her head violently. No, I saw him move. I swear it. We have to open it. Please, someone open the casket. The funeral director, an older man with silver hair, stepped forward cautiously. Miss Langford, I'm afraid that's not possible. Your father's passing was confirmed by medical professionals. I don't care what they said. Evelyn shouted, her voice rising. Open it. Now, the unease in the crowd grew. Some people shifted uncomfortably. Others looked away, unwilling to be part of what was quickly becoming a scene of madness. But a few, just a few, stared at the coffin with growing doubt. What if she wasn't wrong? What if? Before anyone could react, Evelyn broke free from her mother's grasp and lunged toward the casket. The funeral attendants moved quickly, trying to restrain her, but she fought with a strength that shocked them. Tears streamed down her pale cheeks as she pounded on the lid of the coffin. "Daddy, can you hear me?" she sobbed, her voice raw with desperation. "Please, move again. Show them." The chaos reached a breaking point. A few people in the crowd had already started to leave, whispering about grief-induced hysteria, about how losing her father had pushed Evelyn over the edge. But others felt something in the air, a strange, unsettling energy that made their skin crawl. And then, just as the men tried to pull Evelyn away from the coffin, a sound, a faint muffled sound from inside. Heartbeat of silence followed. Then another sound, a thump, a single, unmistakable thump. It came from within the coffin. The world seemed to stop. The thump echoed in the heavy silence, like a thunderclap, sending a ripple of shock through the gathered mourners. Eyes widened, hands clutched chests, and a few people instinctively stepped back, as if the coffin itself had become something unnatural. The priest stammered, his prayer book trembling in his grasp. The funeral attendants exchanged nervous glances, waiting for someone, anyone to speak. Evelyn's breath hitched. Her heart pounded so violently, she thought it might burst from her chest. "Did you hear that?" she gasped, turning to the crowd, desperate for confirmation. "He's alive! He's in there!" For a moment, no one moved. Then, Charlotte Langford's knees buckled, and she had to grab onto the nearest person to keep herself from collapsing. Her lips trembled as she stared at the casket, horror and disbelief warring on her face. "No," she whispered. That's impossible." But before anyone could dismiss it as Evelyn's imagination, it happened again. A louder thump, this time unmistakable. Gasps rang out. A woman in the crowd let out a small scream before covering her mouth, as if she couldn't believe she'd made such a sound. A man near the back shook his head, muttering, "This can't be real." Evelyn didn't hesitate. She spun toward the funeral director. "Open it, now!" The man hesitated, his face pale. "Miss Langford, this isn't—" "Do it!" she shrieked, her voice cracking with desperation. The raw urgency in her tone was enough. Two of the stronger funeral attendants hesitated only a second longer before rushing forward, fumbling with the latches on the casket. The crowd collectively held its breath. Some turned away, afraid of what they might see. Others clutched each other's arms, drawn to the scene, yet dreading the truth. The lid creaked as it was pried open, and then silence. Evelyn's entire body tensed as she peered into the casket, her breath shallow and rapid. The world seemed to narrow to this single moment, this single truth. Her father, Robert Langford, lay before her, his face as lifeless and still as before. His skin was cold, his hands stiff where they rested on his chest. Dead, a sob of confusion and anguish caught in Evelyn's throat. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, I heard it. I heard him." Her voice trailed off as doubt crept in. Had she imagined it? Had grief twisted her mind so cruelly that she'd believed in something impossible? The funeral director exhaled in quiet relief and nodded to the attendants to close the casket again. But just as they reached for The lid. Robert Langford's fingers twitched. Evelyn screamed. Several people recoiled in horror. Charlotte clutched her chest, gasping as if she couldn't breathe. A few people in the crowd turned and ran, their minds unable to process what they had just seen. And then, the thing that would haunt every single person there forever. Robert. Langford's eyes opened. A ragged, wheezing breath escaped his lips. His chest, motionless only moments ago, rose and fell in shallow, trembling gasps. His fingers curled slightly, as though reaching for something, someone. Evelyn could hardly process what she was seeing. Her father, who had been declared dead, who had been embalmed, who had been lying in that coffin for days, was breathing. It was impossible, and yet it was happening. A sharp, strangled noise escaped Charlotte's throat, and she stumbled backward, shaking her head in disbelief. This isn't real," she whispered. "This can't be real." The funeral director was already on his phone, calling for an ambulance, but no one moved to help Robert. No one except Evelyn. She surged forward, grasping his cold, trembling hand. "Dad," she whispered, her voice breaking. His lips parted, but no sound came out. His chest still barely moved, as if every breath was a struggle. His glassy eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment there was something in them. Something beyond confusion, beyond pain, fear. Then barely above a whisper, he rasped 3 words. 3 words that changed everything. "They buried me." A collective shudder rippled through the crowd. The horror in those words, the weight of them, settled like a stone in Evelyn's stomach. She felt sick. Her father had been buried alive. But how? How had the doctors pronounced him dead? How had no one noticed? The questions swirled, but there was no time to answer them now. The paramedics arrived moments later, pushing their way through the stunned crowd. They quickly assessed Robert's condition and loaded him onto a stretcher, their faces grave and unreadable. Evelyn clung to his hand until the very last second, terrified that if she let go, he might slip away again. She didn't notice the way some of the funeral staff exchanged glances. She didn't see the way one of the men, a tall, broad-shouldered figure in a black suit, lingered near the casket, his expression unreadable. But as the ambulance doors slammed shut and sped away, she did notice one thing: the way her father's hand had tightened around hers when he whispered those last words, and the way his fearful eyes flickered, just for a second, toward the funeral director. Evelyn sat in the back of the ambulance, gripping her father's cold hand, as if letting go would send him slipping back into the void. The paramedics worked quickly, their voices low but tense. One of them kept glancing at Robert's face, as if unable to believe what he was seeing. The other checked the monitors, frowning. His pulse is weak, but he's stable, for now. Evelyn could barely process any of it. Just minutes ago, she had been mourning her father, accepting the unbearable truth that he was gone forever. Now, she was watching him cling to life, his breath shaky, his fingers twitching in hers. "They buried me," he had whispered. The words haunted her. She leaned closer, lowering her voice so only he could hear. "Dad." What happened? His eyelids fluttered. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, with great effort, his lips parted. "They did this to me." A shiver ran down her spine. "Who?" she pressed, her heart pounding. "Who did this?" His breathing hitched, his eyes flickering toward the paramedics, then past them, toward the funeral director, who had followed the ambulance in a black car. Robert's grip on her hand tightened, but before he could say another word, the heart monitor let out a sharp, rapid beeping. The paramedics sprang into action, their voices urgent. "He's going into shock," one of them shouted. "We need to get him to the hospital now." Evelyn was pushed back as they worked. Tears blurred her vision. "Dad, stay with me," she cried, but he didn't respond. His body trembled, then went limp. The ambulance swerved as it sped through the streets, sirens wailing. By the time they reached the hospital, Robert Langford was unconscious. The next hours passed in a blur of waiting, doctors rushing in and out, hushed whispers, and worried glances. Evelyn sat curled in a stiff chair, arms wrapped around herself, barely aware of the world around her. Charlotte arrived not long after, her face still pale from shock. She sat beside Evelyn, but neither of them spoke. What could they say? Nothing. About this made sense. Nothing about this felt real. Then, just as Evelyn was beginning to think she couldn't take another second of the waiting, a doctor stepped into the room. His face was unreadable. "Miss Langford," he said gently, "your father is stable." The breath Evelyn had been holding finally escaped her lips. Relief washed over her so suddenly that she felt dizzy. "Can I see him?" she asked, already standing. The doctor hesitated. "There's something you should know first." She froze. "What?" He glanced at Charlotte, then back at her. "Your father didn't suffer a heart attack, as we originally thought. His vitals suggest he was administered a paralytic drug, one that would have slowed his heartbeat to an undetectable level, making it appear as though he had passed away." Evelyn's blood ran cold. Charlotte gasped. "Are you saying someone did this to him?" The doctor nodded grimly. "Yes, and given the timeline, he was likely conscious when he was placed in the coffin." The room tilted. Evelyn reached for the wall to steady herself. Buried alive. Her father had been buried alive. The horror of it clawed at her throat, making it hard to breathe. Who would do something so cruel? And why? Then she remembered. The way her father had looked past her. The fear in his eyes. The way he had tightened his grip when he saw the funeral director. Evelyn's stomach turned. "I need to see him," she said, pushing past the doctor before he could protest. She burst into the hospital room, her breath hitching when she saw him. He was awake now, his skin still pale, his eyes hollow and tired. But when he saw her, something in them softened. "Evelyn," he whispered. Tears filled her eyes as she rushed to his side, taking his hand. "Dad, I'm here." He swallowed hard, his throat raw. "You saved me." The lump in her throat grew. "Who did this to you?" she asked, though she already had a feeling she knew the answer. His fingers twitched weakly against hers. "It was someone I trusted," he rasped. "Someone who wanted me gone." Evelyn's mind raced. Her father's business empire was massive. There were plenty of people who stood to gain from his death. But one person had been there. One person had overseen everything. From the funeral arrangements to the burial itself, the funeral director. She felt sick. "I saw the way you looked at him," she whispered. "It was him, wasn't it?" Her father closed his eyes for a long moment, then nodded. Evelyn's hands clenched into fists. She didn't know why the funeral director had done it. If he had been paid off, if he had his own reasons. But she knew one thing for sure. He wouldn't get away with it. The next morning, Evelyn went straight to the authorities. Armed with the doctor's report and her father's testimony, she made sure that an investigation was launched. The truth unraveled quickly after that. Security footage, phone records, hidden transactions. It turned out that the funeral director had been working with one of Robert's business rivals. A carefully planned scheme. Make it look like a natural death. Bury him before anyone could question it. Silence him forever. But they had made one mistake. They hadn't counted on Evelyn. Within days, arrests were made. The funeral director, the rival businessman, and even a few hospital staff who had falsified the death certificate were taken into custody. Justice was served, and Robert Langford, he recovered. Slowly but surely, he regained his strength, and with Evelyn by his side, he took back everything that had been stolen from him. But the nightmares never truly faded. There were nights when Evelyn would wake up gasping, her mind replaying the sound of that first thump, the way his eyes had opened inside the coffin. And there were nights when Robert would sit awake in the dark, his hand resting over his chest, as if he could still feel the weight of the earth pressing down on him. But they survived, and that Evelyn knew was what mattered most.